there's no sense in which this is a mentally ill process. It may very well be that a number of people who get involved in the killing have certainly sadistic tendencies, and it may well have psychopathic tendencies. But certainly the psychopaths are a minority amongst them. But for the most part, I think it's pretty clear that most of the people involved in this genuinely believed that what they were doing was necessary. And that's what makes it very important to understand it and study it. If it was just a case that they were all mentally ill, there would be no point in studying it. You just go, well, they're mentally ill. They should have all been locked up in an asylum and there's nothing we can take from it. But that's not the case.
Hello. During Nazi rule, it is estimated that 8 million Germans were members of the party. That's around 10% of the population. The ideology they believed in was responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews, as well as gypsies, homosexuals, and the infirm. Millions more were murdered via slave labour and in the invasions at East and West. So what about the mindset of the people who carried out these crimes against humanity? Were they brainwashed by Hitler? Were they mentally ill? Or were they simply all psychopaths? Joining the podcast today is author and broadcaster Laurence Rees to discuss his new book, The Nazi Mind. Laurence is responsible for the hugely powerful TV documentary Nazis, A Warning from History, and his insight into the psychology of Nazis is illuminating. Plenty more history on the way, including the Vietnam War, the causes of the Wars of the Roses, Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, and much, much more. So please do subscribe, follow, and if you can leave a rave review, I'll be most grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Laurence Rees on the Nazi Mind. Laurence, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome.
And I was delighted when your book arrived through the post box, or actually through the hand of the postman, because, of course, I'm a huge admirer of your TV documentary, Nazis, A Warning from History. So this is a real pleasure for me.
Oh, thank you.
So a new book, The Nazi Mind, and I have greatly enjoyed reading through this. And so I suppose I wanted to ask, I was interested in the introduction where you write about meeting a Nazi, an Austrian, I think.
Yeah.
I wondered if I could just ask you a little bit about that, because I mean, have you met? Is he the only Nazi you've met?
Whatever.
Yeah.
No, I met enormous numbers of Nazis.
Okay, but this chap, this Austrian Nazi that you met,
yeah,
it seems like there's a kind. It's like a sort of a two-headed beast in that on the one hand, I mean, they're human beings, of course, but on the one hand, you'll have these individuals who care deeply for their family and probably friends, but then when you go out to the sort of beyond those kind of confines, there's certainly a lack of humanity. And I wondered, is that a trait that's basically reflected across all of them?
Large numbers, I think. I met a guy who's an assistant professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, who in 1940, the Nazis asked all these academics to a meeting in a lecture theatre. And they thought they were going along to hear about how the new regime wanted them to behave now the Nazis had arrived. And actually, as soon as they came in, they were all arrested and immediately bundled off to Dachau concentration camp. And the reason being that one of the crucial things they were trying to do, the Nazis, in Poland, was to target what they called the leadership class and the intelligentsia. So these were absolutely people that they wanted to eliminate one way or another. And he said in the interview how he was in Dachau and saw this guard who had been very cruel to him. And they saw him one day coming in and he was holding his small child and being incredibly loving as a father and as a parent. And in the prologue to the book I've just written, I actually quote from him in the prologue because he said, as a Catholic, I could not imagine this existed, and it tormented me desperately to the brink of suicide. And I think what he said was that it was this duality that was tormented him almost more than anything, that he couldn't simply dismiss these people as the other. They were people unlike us with completely abnormal feelings in every respect. He saw this guy as a absolutely loving father, and yet he was so immensely cruel to them.
That makes me wonder about certainly the Nazis involved right at the sort of sharp end of the atrocities committed by them, in that maybe many listeners have recently watched the film Zone of Interest, which I suppose puts on screen how these people can behave. But one wonders if these visions of the horrors that they're seeing from the 9 to 5 or whatever, however long they're working in their camps, and then returning home, are they able to sort of divide off?
The first thing to say about that is it's a misconception that at Auschwitz, certainly the largest site of mass murder in the history of the world, Auschwitz, so therefore the biggest and most, in terms of scale, the biggest extermination camp that there was. It's a misnomer to think that they're tormented by what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. That's because the vast majority of SS who worked at Auschwitz were not directly involved in the killing process. I met a man called Oscar Groening, who was a member of the SS at Auschwitz, and we filmed an interview with him for the Auschwitz series I made some years ago. And it was revelatory to me because his job at Auschwitz was to work counting he came from a bank. He'd worked in a bank before the war. And his job was to count money taken from the murdered Jews and to organize it being sent back to Berlin. And he said, looking back on Auschwitz, he said, you forget that people don't realize the wonderful friendships you can make working in a place like that. And as he described it, he said it was great because we got drunk most nights because you could tell what new arrival of Jews had arrived at the ramp because many of them would come with alcohol on them and that would be taken from them. So you'd have Hungarian liqueur or a Greek liqueur or something, And he said that was the only way I knew what nationalities were turning up to be killed. And we'd drink all this, and theft was commonplace. Compared to him having to fight on the Eastern Front, it was a glorious life. He represented the SS had an athletic club at Auschwitz, and he represented the SS Auschwitz team at the high jump. He actually, it was when he was first arrived at Auschwitz and he saw what was happening on the ramp, what's called the ramp, where the Jews were arriving, and he saw some SS absolutely brutally treating new arrivals, smashing the heads of babies against trucks, terrible things he saw. And that really upset him. And he complained to the senior non-commissioned officer about it, who said, well, yes, these excesses go on, and you just got to try and make sure you're distanced from them. For the most part, whilst he knew about the nature of the killing process, for the most part, he was completely insulated from it and could have it sounded like, as he described it, as he said, wonderful friendships. And what people don't fully realize is that this is exactly what Himmler and the SS wanted to create in these places, because when Himmler in summer of 1941 is touring the execution, the murder squads operating in the occupied Soviet Union, he visits Minsk in August and witnesses killings, and they're killings from people who are shooting close up, blood, brain everywhere. And the officer in charge of that killing squad says, this is, look at what's happening. Look what's happening to our men. And I met someone, a Luftwaffe officer who accompanied him on that trip, Himmler. And he told us how one of these officers had come up to him saying, for God's sake, get me out of this. I can't take this killing anymore. And it wasn't because he didn't think it was wrong to kill these people. It was because of the psychological issues that he was having killing people close up. So, of course, what the gas chambers did is completely solve that problem from the perspective of the SS.
Yes, in a way, in a sort of twisted way, it made it more humane. Obviously, not for the for the murdered, but for the
Yeah. And
perpetrators.
there's another, exactly, and not humane. I mean, that just
Well,
easy.
no, for them.
No, no, but it's much, and there was another aspect of that that, again, I think people realize that was also crucial, which was that the selections at Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is a complex camp to understand because it is both a concentration and an extermination camp. There are other pure, I suppose, but hard to think of the adjective to describe them, but they solely are involved in extermination. They're operating slightly differently. Places like Treblinka or Sobibor or Belzec in Nazi-occupied Poland. But at Auschwitz, the selections on the ramp are done by doctors who are assessing, are you fit for work, are you not fit for work? And the people who are fit for work aren't going to be saved necessarily. They're going to be worked to death, but they've got a temporary stay of execution, so to speak. And it's doctors doing it. Well, of course, what you've got, if you've got doctors doing it, is you've actually got a sense that there is some medical process involved in this. There is a triage of trained professionals. So when you then go, well, these people have been sent to the gas chambers, well, the doctor thought, that was what was appropriate. And I think that also aided in the sort of distancing and made it much more of a kind of almost, it's a quasi-industrial process anyway, and it helps in the distancing as well.
Right. And I guess there is a temptation to think of many in the regime and many, involved in the killing as brainwashed, but that's not really right either, is it?
No, goodness me, no, 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 no. There's absolutely no evidence that people are doing this because suddenly, they're hypnotized and wake up years later and there's all these dead. I mean, it's just absolute no, no, no. In fact, I devote some pages to an analysis of the Milgram experiment, which is a very famous experiment in psychological terms about the extent to which people are prepared to inflict pain on other people. And one of the many interesting things that comes out of that is that the least effective prompt to getting ordinary people, you might say, to inflict pain on others, the least effective prompt is for the authority figure to say, you must do this. The most effective prompt is to say, well, the experiment demands that this is happening and is needed and so on. And I talked to one of my great intellectual heroes, a guy who's Professor Robert Sapolsky, who's professor of neuroscience at the University of Stanford. And he had a very interesting take on this. And he said that in his lab, when students are experimenting on animals to try and find new drugs, new cures for brain diseases and things, he said you can normally divide it into three groups. You've got the people who come in and immediately simply revolt and can't do it. You've got the people, he said, who discover they enjoy doing it, small proportion. And he said you try and weed them out as soon as you can, because if you're enjoying it, there's something wrong with you. And then you've got this middle group, which is often the majority, and they are troubled by what they're doing, but do it. And he said, well, what's interesting is when you take that group to a hospital and they can see the people who are suffering from the diseases that they're trying to find a cure from, then they go, okay, I understand now why this is necessary. And I think something not dissimilar is happening if you look at these killing squads, which is you have a group of people who find a very small number, but still a group who discover they can't do it. And it's revolted by it for any reason. And they're not punished normally. They're certainly not executed. They're looked on as weak and shunted to the side. And then you've got the people who discover they love it, people who discover in themselves enormous elements of sadism, often sexual sadism, maybe even elements of psychopathy, but certainly sadism. And then you've got this middle ground of people who are doing it, but troubled about it. And what's important for them is not that they're brainwashed in any way. What's important for them is that Himmler and Heydrich go on a tour of the execution sites that summer and essentially do what the authority figure was doing in the Milgram experiment, which is reassure them that what they're doing is right, what they're doing is necessary, and what they're doing is important. And I think those are the things within a structured environment, when you've got your boss saying, look, this in the context of where we are, I can explain to you why this is necessary. It's a hard job, it's a tough job, but we've got to do it. And I think that's the key. Not that they're kind of in some way drugged or brainwashed or anything.
Well, some of them were. I read this elsewhere. I think that some of them were even liberals from Hamburg involved in killings.
Well, I mean, not
Not in today's sort of understanding of what a liberal.
no, but not so. I mean, there's. I think maybe that. Did you read Christopher Browning's ordinary man?
That's it.
Where you got
Yes.
that from?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he talks about this as being. But you see, actually, the issue there is that yes, they make that. His point about Hamburg is it's a liberal city compared to, say, to some other cities in
Munich or
Germany.
something.
But well, Munich's a difficult one because Bavaria is not liberal, but Munich had a traditional liberal. Anyway, but certainly let's talk about
Yes.
Hamburg. So they come from this city, but nonetheless, they are all policemen, and they're not, as my great intellectual mentor, Professor Sri Kershaw, said to me about it. He said they're not exactly the bobbies you meet on the beat. These are security forces. They're not taking liberals off the street in Hamburg and giving them the gun and saying, do this. These are people who are already instruments of the authoritarian nature of the regime that are doing this. And yes, some may have had, they come from a city that's traditionally liberal and so on. But it's not the case, I don't believe, that you're taking people who are steeped in human rights, which it makes it sound like, who are then committing these crimes.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about is if we take Adolf Hitler, who I suppose, if you have to pick one individual, clearly is the most committed. But is this something that is reliant on Adolf Hitler to persuade the Nazi mind to do what it does? And so therefore it was a process. It took a long time. It took 10 odd years of his leadership at least.
Well, there's God, you see, I started off as a making films years ago, and I interview academic historians about stuff, and I'd hate it when they said in an answer to a question like that, well, it's really complicated. Oh, for God's sake, do me, But unfortunately, I've now turned into that, and it's
Yeah.
really complicated because you know, if you unpick the question, it presupposes that Hitler always had this goal in mind, and there's no, I don't, we can't know what's in his head. He's clearly got a deep, visceral level of hatred based on what he perceives as racial hatred about Jews, that they should be expunged. But the fact is, in 1938, at the time of the Evian conference that Roosevelt organizes, it was sort of like a non-conference to see what the Western world and other nations should do about what's going on in Austria and Germany. That at that time, Hitler's view is, you take all the Jews and I'll provide luxury liners for them to go out on. He's interested in expulsion, robbing them, persecution. Yes, there are absolutely some die, and expulsion. So that I don't think there's any evidence that as a practical solution, he's thinking in 1938, mass extermination. Maybe in his head, who knows? But you see the practical level of policy as absolute expulsion. And you see the way the Holocaust develops over a series of escalating points as dealing with the fact that expulsion becomes impossible once Britain stays in the war beyond 1940, once America enters the war at the end of 1941, once the war in the East is going in the way it's going. There are all sorts of different escalatory points. But so the premise of the question is, he always had this in mind and he's got to convince people to do it. It takes him a long time. I don't think the premise isn't right, because he has a vision, which is the Jews are the most dangerous people that you are imaginable. They are a problem to him that must be dealt with one way or another, depending on the situation. And when you have a regime that buys into that view, which many people do, then you can see how you begin to go along this line. I think the crucial thing to understand is that nobody is asked from a standing start to to go off and be involved in killing in a gas chamber. That this is the sense of the Jews are a danger that must be dealt with one way or another is ongoing. The sense of massive hypocrisy of the West not taking Jews, because of course when he says take all our Jews and the West goes, well, we think it's terrible what you're doing, but we're not taking them. He goes, hypocrites, hypocrites. And there's a lot of evidence, there's evidence psychologically, which I hadn't understood before, that people hate a hypocrite even more than a direct liar. Because
Yeah, and that Avian conference was particularly
Evian conference, which most people don't know about, I think is an incredibly important moment on this journey, because you read the Nazi the SS newspaper um, immediately after that, and it is exactly this sense of, yeah, look, we're the only people in the world who are being honest about this problem. And so you see that it's possible for them to get to a position of the killing of saying, we never wanted it to go that we never want, who wanted it to end up like this, but if you'd been different, it wouldn't have. So I mean, I think that's it's obviously it's a corruption of what happened.
yeah, it's a bit ridiculous.
But
Yeah,
if you're interested in their mentality,
yeah.
that's what some of these people are thinking. Only we are tough enough, strong enough, hard enough to do this, and that's especially the case once they get involved in killing small children. And Himmler is saying, look, what do you want to do? Leave these people to grow up to be a group of avengers who our children have to deal with. So there's almost a sense that you show that you love your own children by killing these children, so that your children never have to deal with them. And that's the sort of horrible, corrupt rationalization that's being used.
It's fascinating that you've spoken to a lot of psychoanalysts or
No, psychologists and neuroscientists.
Okay, right. You're probably a lot better at the distinction on that than I am, actually. But
Well, it's like they're not. What I don't think is right is, and I think it's absolutely fruitless and potentially dangerous, is to start trying to, at a distance, psychoanalyze. Like Hitler, was it so?
yeah.
Was he swaddled wrong as a baby? Was he? I mean, I think that's, there's as I write in the book, anyone tempted to do that should read the Walter Langer's assessment of the mind of Adolf Hitler, which he wrote for the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. And there's a whole chunk in there, for example, about how he says, Hitler built the tea house on the Kalkstein, which is a mountain very, very high up, which became known as the Eagle's Nest. He's got his house, the Berghof, lower down the mountain, and the Eagle's Nest right at the top. And Langer says, no, he built this house. It's clear that this is built as a return to the womb, because you reach it by a tunnel and a lift. So can there be a greater example of Hitler's desire to return to the womb than this? Well, actually, Hitler never liked that place particularly. He found it too high. Didn't like it. It was the brainchild of Martin Bormann, his secretary, who wanted it made. So, it's nonsensical. So I absolutely don't think that it's a fruitful route to try and psychoanalyze people at years distant. It's potentially dangerous. What is valuable, I think, is to look at how the human mind, the minds they had, are the minds we've got, in the sense that physiologically the mind hasn't changed much in 20,000, 30,000 years. And you can see all sorts of biases, of ways that the mind processes things, the use of what a neuroscientist would call the them and us dichotomy, the way that the frontal cortex is developed, the way that it works to compare your enemy to animals, that triggers things within the brain, the way conspiracy theories function as a useful conduit to actually not having guilt in you, the way that faith, for example, is a crucial aspect of all this. That once somebody as a brilliant psychologist called Leo Festinger proved in experiment analysis in the 1950s. He demonstrated that once someone's found a profound faith-based belief and acted upon it and gone down that road, it's almost impossible to change their mind by reason, because they never got into doing that by reason. They got into it by faith. So there's all these things which psychologists and neuroscientists have studied that I think are enormously valuable to us in trying to look at what we can take from this history, not as a lesson, because I don't believe history has lessons, but as a warning.
Indeed. Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Now, okay, so there's a temptation then to think that the Nazi mind is effectively, mentally ill, but what you're really sort of demonstrating is that it's more about how their brain is working rather than the fact that there's any.
But how are they mentally ill? Just because they do terrible things? I
Yeah.
mean, how many people, you see, the difference between, so what you got to understand is that
But people do horrible things all the time.
People do horrible things all the time, but also they're in the context of a legally constituted state. So they are thinking they're doing the right thing. It's not like a criminal psychopath out on the streets today who, unless they're literally kind of believing they're Napoleon or something, thinks they're doing the right thing. I mean, criminals tend to think they're doing the wrong thing, but for profit, or they in a crime of passion. People accept most of the time, don't they, that they've done a terrible thing in hurting someone, but they're overcome by emotion, all of that. This is completely different from that. This is a cultured state at the heart of Europe that has a government, functioning government, that has enacted laws to persecute a group within that society, that is making what many people see as a whole series of rational demands on other nations. The hypocrisy of Britain having colonies, for example, whilst as they see it, Germany's denied colonies, a whole range of different things. So there's no sense in which this is a mentally ill process. It may very well be that a number of people who get involved in the killing have certainly sadistic tendencies, and it may well have psychopathic tendencies, but certainly the psychopaths are a minority amongst them. But for the most part, I think it's pretty clear that most of the people involved in this genuinely believed that what they were doing was necessary. And that's what makes it very important to understand it and study it. If it was just a case that they were all mentally ill, there would be no point in studying it. You just go, well, they're mentally ill. They should have all been locked up in an asylum, and there's nothing we can take from it. But that's not the case.
So I was speaking to Richard Evans a few months ago, who's written a book on Hitler's People. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, no, I know it.
And it was interesting, towards the end of the conversation, he was talking about, the logical, Hitler wanted, if we sort of suspend our disbelief for a moment and imagine that the war did not end when it did, and the Germans were winning.
Yeah.
Evans was talking about he wanted to just go on and on fighting,
absolutely,
forever and ever and ever. Now, presumably, with that in mind, or does the Nazi mind, because he wants to head west and start invading Britain, or if they were if they were successful, or heading east, or even America, or whatever, they become so fantastically successful. Do they migrate from the hated enemy, the Jew, onto, the Slav, the Brit, the
Oh,
American?
but they're already there. They're already there. I mean, the key thing, I think, well, I don't know that so Hitler didn't have a visceral hatred for the British. He admired the British in many respects. Again, not generally known and understood, and it should be. For many years, he wanted some kind of alliance with the British, as that one former member of the Waffen SS I met all those years ago said to me over that lunch. He said, "What a tragedy Churchill came along, because some other wiser politician would have, or Churchill should have realized that we should have made an alliance." He said, "We would have ruled the land, you would have ruled the sea. It's perfect." So, I don't think there's not a racial hatred, certainly as far as they're concerned, of the British or of the Scandinavians come to that. There is a deep racial hatred of the peoples in the East, so much so that on the eve of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Himmler has a conference of senior SS officers at his castle at a place called Wewelsburg, and he tells them that in the forthcoming war, hasn't started yet, it's about to start, the war against Stalin. He says that to them, in the forthcoming war, they should expect 30 million people to die. And they're going to die in large part deliberately, because the Nazis are going to starve them. So this is way more than the killing of the Jews. The killing of the Jews you have to see is as the most crucial epicenter of their hatreds, and what they see as the thing they have to do. But wider than that, in the penumbra, they want the land, the fertile land and resources in the East. They don't want many of the people living on it. So from the beginning, they have a policy of starvation and mistreatment. If they took about, roughly from memory, 5.7 million Soviet prisoners of war, they killed or died in captivity between 3.3 and 3.5 million. If it hadn't been for the Holocaust, that would have been the biggest single atrocity of the war. And yet, how many people know that they were doing that? Millions and millions of Soviet prisoners of war. And I met one of these guys who survived the camp, who talked about how they were reduced to cannibalism. They're reduced to eating dead people's livers. They're reduced, so. And this is happening because in the Nazi mind, these people are subhuman. And so it's if the war hadn't have stopped and they pushed on within the Soviet Union, they would have been looking to colonize it and to eliminate large millions and millions of the people who were there. And the trouble is, when you say that, well, okay, maybe that's mentally mad, you've got to understand that Himmler was talking at one point, I can't remember exactly where, I think in his table talk, he talks about, say, that what he calls, unquote, the Redskins, unquote, quote unquote, and how they all died in America. He envies the British for controlling India. Not that we were involved in mass killings in the India, but nonetheless, the racial master is controlling the natives. In Poland, they have a plan not just to eliminate the intelligentsia and the leadership class, but they don't want Poles to be able to read. What's the point in them? They're slaves. They shouldn't read. So it's a vast, vast plan of colonization, the like of which the world's not seen, but aspects of it in terms of what people have done through the centuries, in terms of going into Cortez going into Mexico and grabbing Mexico away from Montezuma and the Aztecs. It's a common thing human beings seem to have been doing throughout history. What's shocking about this one in particular is the scale of it, is the quasi-industrial form of it, is the notion that with the Jews they want to eliminate every single one of them, which I think is unusual. Is certainly, I don't know of another case of that in history. And the fact that this is happening in sort of factories of death, and that they're doing it over a short period. They're taking aspects of it, and it's different from what's gone before, but the essential nature of it in terms of brutal, horrendous colonization has been practiced by human beings for thousands of years.
And how important then was Adolf Hitler in this? I mean, well, I mean, he died and he killed himself. But was there anyone else in the regime that you think could have allowed, the mindset to continue?
Well, we can't know, but I'm a big believer that, Ian Kershaw said to me, once when we were talking about it, he said, no Hitler, no Holocaust. And I think that's right. I mean, the trouble with counterfactual history is it's sort of a waste of time, because you take one thing out and who knows, it can spiral away like kind of DNA, so I don't know, who knows. But one would suspect that you take away Hitler from this, and would you have had a kind of a nationalist right-wing government that was trying to right the wrongs as they saw it of the Versailles Treaty? Yeah, almost certainly. Would that have led to war? Maybe it depends how the other European nations would have reacted if they'd pressed on with their demands more so. Clearly, the Danzig corridor issue in Poland is a big issue. The notion of the Volksdeutsch in Poland, that was something that was these are all things that were bubbling under and causing enormous kind of angst. Would someone have pushed forward to try and solve those things from a German perspective? Probably. But would it have led to this? Oh, very, very hard to think so, because the level of radicalism, the level of hatred that's emanating from that individual is unbelievable.
Well, you mentioned this Waffen SS member, and in 1945 the war ends, and a lot of these Nazis return to German society, and this particular individual becomes quite senior in a car company.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that wasn't unusual. There were plenty of
all.
ex-Nazis, weren't there? Yes.
Not at all. Not at all. It's in fact it's the run of the mill. I mean, that's and there's lots of reasons why that happened. One of the most obvious is the Cold War, which is that what happens that you get a situation where there's a fear that if you take all the people who professed Nazi beliefs out of what was then becoming Western Germany, you wouldn't have a functioning state. And you crucially need a functioning army to stay there against the Eastern Front, the armies of the Warsaw Front, Warsaw Pact. So, so there's a view taken, which is, well, okay, well, maybe the senior figures we can go for, and maybe some of the killers involved in the Einsatzgruppe and so on. But the broad mass of people is fine. Look at Oscar Groening, the SS man I met who worked at Auschwitz. After the war, he was imprisoned briefly. He was imprisoned, I think, for a couple of years as a POW, but he described that as he had a rather lovely time. He was sent to Britain, and he joined the POW choir, and he said they were sent round in Scotland singing to people, and he said that's where his love of Scotland came from. People were very hospitable to him, and then he came back, and he couldn't get his job back in the bank because he'd been in the SS and the bank didn't want him, but he got a job as a personnel officer in a glassworks where he was had a very nice life, and he ended up as an honorary judge of personnel tribunal cases in the region he was in. And it wasn't until he was very, very old that the Germans decided to prosecute him, and that was only because of a change in policy very late on for the German. They knew where he was. It wasn't that he'd hidden about it, so he got off. He didn't get off scot-free, because when he was actually finally prosecuted and sentenced to, I think, 4 years for accessory to murder, and then died before in his 90s before the sentence came. But the vast majority of SS at Auschwitz, absolutely no prosecution of any kind. So, is that a terrible thing to have happened? Absolutely, that's a terrible thing to have happened. But in the situation at the time, with the swift move on to feeling that our erstwhile ally Stalin was now the enemy, a potential enemy, you can understand the processes by which it happened.
And I'm just interested in the mindset of them when they return to a sort of Western democracy that West Germany was certainly.
Well,
And
again, it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum. You had some people I met who couldn't get over the bitterness of it and believed, focused on this hypocrisy, focused on this idea that they had, this idea fixed in their mind that they'd been hypocritically treated, that this was victor's justice and so on. And then you had another bigger group who basically thought, well, as one SS man put it to us in an interview, a man I met, he said, well, that's over. Now we've got something else. So you move on. And I think human beings, one of the reasons we're ruling the planet and other animals aren't, is because we're enormously psychologically adaptable. And you see that once the Nazis come to power, how many people. Don't forget, the Nazis come to power. The Nazis never got the majority of the vote in Germany, even when Hitler came to power as Chancellor. And yet then you see, arguably, and there's lots of scholarly work around this, mass support for the Nazis developing. Why? Well, because one report I saw from the outlawed Social Democrat Party, people ultimately want to have an easy life, want to have a family life, want to earn some money, they don't want to go to the barricades, they don't want to sacrifice themselves. So it's a new regime. Hey, let's get on with it. And I think, again, that's what many people felt, although I think they retained this belief that there'd been this terrible injustice done to them because of the hypocrisy of the Western states. And the very fact that the West was now concerned about Stalin and communism, they thought proved that they'd always been right in targeting Bolshevism. It proved that Hitler was right to actually say, that's where the enemy threat is, that's what we need to deal with.
Right. Well, before we started recording, you mentioned, I don't know what level it is. Are you annoyed, harassed, emailed, strongly worded emails from Holocaust deniers? I mean, do you have a sense of how Holocaust deniers are in significant numbers?
No, I don't think there are significant numbers. I think the trouble is that what social media has done is massively amplify it. So the problem, you see, when I was on briefly on social media, you'd get all this stuff saying, and you knew you were dealing with the Holocaust denier because they would all start off, or not all of them. Some of them would just say, "Rot in hell! I'd like to kill you. I'd like." Some of them would just go, "You are." I'm not Jewish. So when they discovered I wasn't Jewish, that sort of puzzled them for a minute, and then they go, "Well, you're a Jewish
A shill or
yeah,
something.
yeah,
Yeah.
shill. That's right. That's shill. I learned that new word.
Yes.
Yeah, apparently." And someone called me the devil's spawn. I remember, which
Right.
imaginative idea. You're a phony. Any number of just abuse. In a way, the more sophisticated, and this is the way it was going, would say, anyone who writes to you or anyone who puts on Twitter or anything, I'm not a Holocaust denier, but
But
I'm a skeptic. And can you run by me the traces of Zyklon B in Crematoria 2 at Birkenau? I don't quite see how that fits within the. So you get initially I was a real sucker. I got drawn into some of this. And then I realized actually the trouble is that if you've been well brought up, as I like to think my parents brought me up well, I'm sure I did lots of bad things after, but I like to think if you're well brought up, you kind of take people at face value and you try and discuss things and so on. And you believe that the purpose of discussion and argument is to reach some kind of new position, the kind of dialectic. What you realize is going on here isn't any desire for information whatsoever. What's going on here is a desire to unpick the objective truth within the history and try and find any little niche to twist it. And that they've discovered that that's best done under this guise of skepticism. And the analogy I used was it's like taking people who are members of the Flat Earth Society and you put them in a rocket and you take them up and you show them the world and I can imagine them looking out and saying, my God, that's a clever deception. That happened to me with this Belgian SS guy. We showed him, he said, obviously the Holocaust, it's a lot of it. He said, I have to be careful, but the fact is a lot of it is suspect. And we said, haven't you seen the footage or the camps, the pictures? And he just went, and you believe those pictures are real? So, I mean, where are you going to go? You can't go anywhere with that. And that's why conspiracy theories are so dangerous and so powerful. I mean, I came up with one, which is prove to me that the Normans weren't extraterrestrials with pointed heads, which is why all their helmets are shaped like that over their heads. Prove to me that that's not the case. Well, how are you going to do that? Prove to me that we're not all controlled by extraterrestrials who are inside our brains. It's crazy town. It's crazy town once you go down that route. So,
but your Belgian SS guy,
yeah,
it's quite illuminating when you hear of Nazis themselves actually saying, "Oh, well, that didn't happen," as if it is a shameful thing that happened. And they're accepting that fact.
No, they recognize it. I mean, here's the evil. I mean, there's so much horror in this. They look on it as a kind of Jewish crime to make up the Holocaust. But that's not an uncommon human reaction. Stalin was involved in this horrendous crime of Katyn, which is where tens of enormous large numbers of the Polish intelligentsia and some Ukrainians from Eastern Poland, intelligentsia and politicians and soldiers, officers, were killed, not just at a place called Katyn near Smolensk, but at a couple of other murder sites in the Soviet Union. It's just that at Katyn, the Germans dug up and uncovered these bodies during the war, and they pointed to it, rightfully, as a Soviet war crime. The NKVD under Stalin had committed these terrible, terrible murders. And the Poles, who had been missing these officers, the Polish army had missed these officers, obviously. There was a meeting with Stalin about this, and Stalin was just kind of laughing at them, going, "Oh, I don't know, where have you looked for them somewhere else, these Poles?" And once it was revealed that it was pretty certain that as certain as we can be, that Stalin and his henchmen were responsible for this, he essentially said to the Poles, "You've got to say it was the Germans who did this, or we're going to break off all contact with you." And the Poles needed a relationship with Stalin by that stage in the war. Otherwise, how are they going to get their country back? And how are they going to get the borders delineated as they feel is correct? So they were so Stalin made it even worse. He didn't just commit the crime and blame someone else. He got the victims, the people who were the victims of the crime, the Poles, and threatened them to say something they were as certain as they could be wasn't the case about somebody else. So I don't see it necessarily as a particularly Nazi thing to do. I think it's a human thing to do.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. It really has, Laurence. So I just thank you for your time. It's just to delve into the Nazi mind. Yes, and very much warning us from history. So links are in the show notes for listeners. Laurence, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for listening. Plenty more history on the way, so please do share with friends and family. And please do not be persuaded by me to leave a generous 5-star review, as that might be considered unethical. So in the meantime, thank you and good night.